Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for a really wonderful introduction. Frederica had written me that she knew me when she was doing the introduction, and now I realize that we actually tried very hard to recruit you to Harvard, and in fact lost. So I guess it's sort of just desserts here. But anyway, it's terrific to be here, and I'm going to talk about a topic that is very much a work in progress, and in fact is kind of a long story that's unfolding. So most of my life I've been a social epidemiologist, and most of my work has been in aging. And at some point somebody said to me, you know, really aging is like not worth talking about. Wouldn't it be much better to study early childhood? And they kind of said, well, you know, it's much easier to send the rocket up straight than to try to get it to go like this when it lands. And in fact, I think that's really compelling. And for a long time, I tried actually to move from aging back into earlier in the life cycle. And every time I did it, I feel like NIA snatched me away again. And in fact, most of my work is on aging. So today it is about aging, but it actually is what I've sort of euphemistically called the longish arm of early adulthood and middle age. And one of the things that I want us to think about collectively, and you all actually know a lot about it, is that most of life course epidemiology, and in fact I would say most of life course work, has focused so heavily on very, very early childhood that they've almost forgotten that life course actually means life course, and that there are other developmental points and trajectories that make a difference, that people's lives aren't really completely, determined early in childhood. And even though early childhood is a very, very important point, I don't want to dispute that, it isn't the only point at which in the life course people's experiences and conditions actually shape their long-run outcomes. And in this case, I'm very interested in aging and health outcomes. So I'll tell you the next phase of what got me interested in this is that I was on a National Academy of Science panel a number of years ago, actually before a lot of the literature on inequality and educational differences came out, and it was on the stagnation of life expectancy for women in the United States and what had been going on compared to all other countries. It was a great National Academy of Science panel. It was chaired by Sam Preston and Eileen Crimmins. I was on it, and Michael Marmot was on it, Johann Machenbach was on it, a lot of other terrific people. But this was the fundamental question, and this is the question that actually changed the course of what I've been working on for the last probably 5 or 6 years. So you see the United States in the middle in the 1980s, and in fact, if you went back and looked at 1950s, 60s, 70s, you would see the United States never does great in terms of life expectancy, but we don't do really terribly. This is for women. For men, things are slightly better, but they're not enormously better, but they're worse for women. And then over time, what happens is we improve a tiny bit overall, and every other country in the world, in OECD countries, of wealthy industrialized countries, overtakes us. So any country that was behind us like swoops ahead, and it leaves us virtually at the bottom in terms of life expectancy. And again, men look almost the same, a little bit better. But this stagnation in life expectancy was really staggering once we got a hold of it. It was something that, in a way, we knew that life expectancy was improving. So if you look only at the within-country differences within the United States, you don't feel like we're doing so badly. But when you look at the international rankings, it becomes pretty shocking. So this was a group, this National Academy of Sciences group, that was meant to uncover what the reasons were for this. And I would say, even though I adore all the people on the committee, that we failed miserably, that we actually accounted for almost none of this. I would say the only thing that we accounted for with some credibility was smoking. And it is true that women during this time smoked, and smoking does account for some of the stagnation in life expectancy. Apart from that, I think we looked at every usual suspect. We looked at all the health behaviors, we looked at health care, We looked at inequality. We had a great chapter on inequality, which showed how important inequality was, but didn't account for the country level differences. We had a chapter that I wrote with Jim Smith and James Banks on social engagement and networks and relationships. That was like zip. Again, all these things were really important, but they didn't account for the differences. They didn't account for why the United States had stagnated. And we just came to the end of the report, and it kind of says, smoking, and we ended the report. And after that, NIA was very unhappy. NIH was sort of unsettled, and they issued these calls for research projects. And so we applied for one because as time was going on, I was mulling over, why aren't we looking at some new, really creative? It can't be something we've all kind of wrapped our head around. And so that's one part of the story. The other part of the story, and there are a lot of ways to show this, but this is a Brookings report that just came out, and because the graphs are really beautiful and actually probably conservative in some ways, I wanted you to see these. So remember, the United States is at the bottom, but what's also really true is that inequality has grown during this time, and inequality in health has grown even more. So this is a set of plots looking at life expectancy at age 50 for women born in two cohorts. This is the 1920 cohort. This is the 1940 cohort. And what they did that was really, I thought, quite clever was look at deciles of risk for income, and then they did another one for education. So I think you're probably quite familiar with the education differentials and mortality, which show these absolute mortality increases, and lots of arguments about selection into education categories over time. But because this is looking at deciles, it kind of avoids that whole selection issue. And what you see is that for women in the bottom decile, there's been no, absolutely zero increase in life expectancy if you look at these data for these decades. And in fact, if you look at really basically the second decile, the third decile, for men there are 1.7 years increase in life expectancy. It takes you 30% of the female population to get to that 1.7 years that men at the bottom decile improved. Virtual stagnation for women at the bottom. At the top, there's about a 6.5 year improvement in life expectancy. And this is what it is for men. And you can see here the 1.7 years, and out here there's 8-point-something years. So what's happened over this time is that actually men at the top have risen more. Their life expectancy has improved. It actually is closing the gender gap because women aren't improving even at the top as much, right? And at the bottom, it's truly miserable. Now, there are other ways you can do this. You can look at education, and you can sometimes see this absolute decrease in life expectancy or increase in mortality if you look at people by education. The Brookings folks did it looking at both Social Security data and earnings as well as education. They looked at SIP data and HRS data. And basically, while there are differences between all those things, always women at the bottom have virtual stagnation during this period.
Is this life expectancy at birth, though?
No, it's 50.
Well, first of all, I'm wondering how they would get 50 people born in 1940, but the x-axis looks like it, the y-axis looks like it's life expectancy.
So, this is, because they just converted it to years. It is like 22 years or something like that. That's what it is.
How do they get it if you're born in 1940? How do they know life expectancy?
They don't. They do those life expectancy tricks that demographers do. Actually, it bothers me a lot. That was one of the things.
For the cohort born in 1920, they can get a pretty good real thing.
Right. But no, for 1940, they can't. So you're absolutely right. And what we have thought about is going back and actually looking at the mortality rates, because they're synthetic at this point, right? They aren't really the mortality rates for literally this cohort. But the report actually goes from 1910 to 1950 and shows it. But what I want to say is that any way you look at it, it doesn't look very different than this. And each way has a problem. Each way has a limitation. But basically, you see this kind of stagnation at the bottom. So I started to think, well, what is it that happened between kind of 1960 and 1970 and now that could possibly explain anything about why women would do badly and actually why men aren't doing so terrific either. And that's when I started to think about the work-family issues. And here, of course, we're on, I think, familiar territory for you. This is the share of mothers who were in the labor force, which of course rose enormously during this time period. During the time period in the United States, women basically joined the workforce. If they were in couples, they were dual wage earners most often. If they were single, they were working. And this is the share of births to unmarried women, which is literally unmarried women right now. And we'll talk about the couple part. That also has arisen enormously since from 1960. So part of our group started to think, well, maybe it's something about both joining the workforce in these unparalleled numbers and this combination of being a single parent that is one of the things that changed a lot. And this whole National Academy of Science report never looked at it that way. We never thought about a new risk. We only thought about risks that we knew. And then the other thing, of course, is formal social protection policies in the United States, where, I have another one that looks at over time, but here's the United States, has FMLA, and that's it. And so other countries have had changes in female employment, lots of labor force joining during this time, lots of declines in fertility, lots of single parenting. It's not like we're the only country in the world, but we are virtually the only country in the world that doesn't have a social protection policy coupled with these dynamics. When you put them all together, it felt like this is the perfect story. So I'm going to take you kind of sequentially through the work that we've been doing. It's actually about 4 papers that I'm going to show you findings from, and hopefully we will leave enough time to have some discussion afterwards. But each one builds a little bit more sequentially in looking at the issues that we wanted to explore. And again, from my perspective, what was really interesting was to see whether these early and midlife experiences would explain long-run outcomes in terms of health outcomes happening to older men and women later, in this case, older women mostly. So this is a study of the effects of single motherhood and late life disability and health. And the idea was that there was a lot of research that showed that single motherhood was associated with increased health risks in varied countries. Mostly they're very contemporaneous with the experience of single motherhood. So when you're a single mother, this is what happens. And there's a huge issue of selection through all of this that we probably want to think about. And then the other thing is that we know that these associations vary across countries and different cultures and with different social policies. So we wanted to be able to look at that. And our idea was that single motherhood earlier in life would be associated with worse health outcomes in older adulthood, and that the most health damaging, it would be most health damaging in countries with relatively weak social protection policies, like the United States and actually England at that time. And the sample that we used is the health and retirement in the United States. We used the English longitudinal study, ELSA, and we used SHARE. And we looked at the long-run effects of women among women who had children. So we excluded women without any children before the age of 50 in this analysis. So first of all, this is the percent of women 50 and over who had some single motherhood experience in their life, looking at HRS SHARE and ELSA. And you can see here what the percentages are. So the United States was 32%, Scandinavia is 38%, England 22%. When you count cohabitation or non-marital partners, you see it really falls in Scandinavia to about 26%, but pretty substantial. Now think that these are people who were mothers basically in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, a few in the 1940s, but basically that's the decade we were looking at. For this, the United States and HRS originally like, didn't want to ask that question. So there actually are no data early on partnerhood in the HRS survey that would allow you to know that. You know what their status is currently, but you can't go back and figure out whether they were actually living with a partner at that time. I think we don't do that in the United States. So the outcomes are looking at activities of daily living, instrumental activities of daily living, and self-rated health that we're going to look at. And our comparison group is mothers without single motherhood experience before age 50. So they're all mothers, right? The comparison is mothers married versus single, basically. And really, we have these regions to look for, and we control for a number of things, including when we did some sensitivity analysis for early childhood exposures and divorce among their parents and things like that. So first of all, these are the adjusted relative risks of having an activity of daily living limitation. And the only difference between Model 1 and Model 2 is that here we control for household income and wealth. In Model 2, otherwise we're controlling for all these things: education, marital status, number of children, that sort of thing. And lo and behold, one of the things that happens here is that if we just look at Model 1, you'll see what we didn't expect, which is that these are the regions that had high risks, where single motherhood actually had a high risk of activity of daily living. Now, in our head, we were pretty sure Scandinavia was going to be, the model, the solution. In fact, it wasn't, and we can come back to that. The countries that did better were those in Southern European places, especially, and often in share, they're worried about the Eastern European data, so we don't have much to say about that. But the risks here are in the US, the UK, and Scandinavia. And when you control for income or wealth, what you see is that it drops a lot for the United States. So part of the reason single moms are potentially have poor ADLs in later life is actually that they are much poorer. So poverty explains some of that pathway potentially in the United States. A little bit in England, less in Scandinavia, and so forth. So wealth is not an inconsiderable risk, but it doesn't tell the whole story, because at the end here you still have these risks, right? And we can go through this for all the other outcomes, self-rated health. You see very similar findings. And here we look at the adjusted risks of any single motherhood conditional on having 8 to 13 years of education. Duration. And you can see again that a longer duration, or I'm sorry, I'm reading this wrong. This is age. So it's not actually duration, it's age. This just got confused. So these are people who were single mothers before age 20. They have the highest risks. These are women who were single mothers sometime in the late 40s. They have much lower risks. And these are for all the outcomes. So young people who were single mothers, young, had higher risks. It's also totally related to duration. So again, you see women who had longer periods of single motherhood were at greater risk than others. And actually, whether you were a single mom because you were either divorced or you were single when you had your child, have elevated risks. And widowhood has much lower risk, but not nothing. I should say that the only place where really it was important, where widowhood was really related to risk, was in the UK. And I've talked to a lot of people in the UK about that. It's quite interesting to see what they think about why it was so hard to be a single mother if you were widowed. Some of these people are widowed during the war, right? So it's not like a selection factor into single parenthood in the way we think about it, but it's a different experience and still seems to be associated with these long-run outcomes. So there are a lot of things I'm sure you're thinking about, and we can come back and talk about them. One of the things that was most important is that when you look at early childhood SES, including divorce and early income and health, which we could do in ELSA and SHARE, not so much in HRS, It accounted for some of it, but not very much. And it was surprising how little it counted for. So early childhood selection into single parent is something that we know is true, but that it accounts for this association with poor health in older ages is much more limited in this case. We also tried our very, very best to look at the impact of partnership and cohabitation in this study. And again, cohabitation falls somewhere between being married and being single in your risk. And actually, in our recent analyses, it looks like cohabitation, even in the United States today, is closer to being single than it is to being married in terms of protecting you long-run risks or being associated with these long runs. So overall, single motherhood experience was most health damaging in England, next in the United States and Scandinavia, a little bit less in Western Europe, with no significant associations in Southern Europe. If you looked at France, Italy, Spain, just zero risk. And my sort of off-the-cuff hypothesis, these are all like pretty Catholic countries. It was divorce is actually low, you know, the risk of divorce is low. And my theory is people were really upset, and then they went, oh, like, and brought people into the fold in some way. But we have no data on this. So completely speculation. We have no data on what the housing circumstances were really like for people at the time they were single parents, which would be really nice. And the other thing is divorced single mothers and single moms at younger ages were at higher risk. Okay, so that's step one. Now I'm going to move and actually look at more complex constellations that start to incorporate work. You'll notice that we didn't talk about work at all in this single motherhood paper, and try to see whether we can start to look at that. So we have a second step in this about cumulative work-family strain predicting mortality risk in older American women. This is just among American women, and Erica Sabbath, who is my doc student, who's now an assistant professor at Boston College, did a lot of this work, did a really nice job. So we know, again, for the work-family literature in health, that there are some short-term associations. They're actually not incredibly strong in terms of traditional work-family measures. We also know that there's some associations between work-family demands and sickness absence, cardiovascular risk. We also know that there's, you know, if you think about cumulative roles, that there are positive spillovers, that we often think that there's both selection into work and parenthood, so healthy people are more likely to work and have children, and most of us probably believe that there's positive spillover, that both of these roles are very rewarding, and it would be nice if there weren't negative outcomes to this experience. And there's some data that there are positive spillovers. So you could imagine this goes actually either way in terms of the forces out there. So the weaknesses of the existing approach on most work-family exposures are that it's almost always a single exposure time point. Almost say, okay, when you had your first kid, or what were you like when you were 40 or something. And we know that of all the things that change in the world, your work history, your marital history, and your family, your parental status change over time. This is not a one-shot exposure. So they're not constant throughout time, and it's very hard to figure out how to measure this. So I'm going to show you something that actually isn't a completely satisfactory solution. But it was a creative one that we thought took us to the next step, and it had to do with sequence analyses, which people often do for genetics, and they're ways of putting together different patterns of sequences. So in this, we're going to look at HRS women, about 7,500 women born between 1935 and 56. They had to have complete data on marriage, work, and child history, or we did some imputations. So about 3% of women needed partial imputation. Nobody was imputed for childhood, and 25% actually had some imputations for work years because, again, HRS does not have a complete work history. It asks about the occupation for your longest life, longest job, what you're doing now, so it requires some imputation. And for mortality, we're going to look at mortality between somebody's birthday and 2011, when the last mortality data were available. We have a 5-year washout period, so we didn't look at people who died like in the year that they just finished collecting data. And we looked at the National Death Index data that HRS has and supplemented it with proxy reports. And we're going to look at age at death by month and year. And so in order to build this exposure assessment, we need information on whether somebody was married and in what year did they have children under 18 at home, and were they working. So there are 8 possible combinations. We actually collapsed a few of the no kids category. They weren't telling us very much. And just to show you the dilemma, there are theoretically 4 times 10 to the 31st ways women could combine marriage, work, and children between 16 and 50. And actually, of the 7,536 HRS women, when you looked at this, there were, in fact, 6,489 distinct pathways, experiences. So if you look at each individual person and try to take all this into consideration, you're sunk. Like there needs to be a way to summarize this and get the meaningful stuff without being bogged in this. So this was our solution, and I don't pretend it's the totally ultimate solution, but it was a way for us to look at these trajectories and look at sequences and times that people experience different things. And so we did this sequence analysis, which is very similar to genetic sequence analysis, and kind of clusters people. I mean, if you think of it as a clustering, that's kind of what it is. And here we came up with 6 or 7, actually we chucked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Pathways. We chucked the last one because it was not a lot. And here, for example, you can see this is the period where people are not working and not having kids. Then they're no work, no marriage, but they have kids. And then they go back to not working and having no kids, right? So that's one sequence. If you look at the most common sequence, this is people who start off and they're 16 to 20 or so, not working, no kids. Then they go to work, they still don't have kids. And then the green is they have all 3. They're working, they're married, they have kids, and then they're working and no kids. So there are all these combinations. This is the other common one, no work, but they are married and they have kids. So there are all these sequences that clustered together empirically to describe most people in the cohort. So then we took these sequences and looked at different outcomes. So if we just take these sequences, these are age standardized now, but they're still just sequences. We're not controlling for a lot of things. We looked at the healthiest, the people with the lowest mortality, married mothers who worked earlier. So people who took some time, worked earlier, and then took some time off. And here, married mothers who worked later, that is, they took some time off earlier, and then they went to work, have the lowest mortality risks here. So people who had all 3, but they finagled a little at the beginning or the end, right? Interesting, working non-mothers had slightly elevated risk. Married mothers who always worked, a little bit risk. Married mothers who never worked, they actually do worse, right? And they'll stay that way, which is very interesting in terms of combinations of working. And here you have single moms who are either working or non-working. These are the non-working moms during this time with hugely elevated risks. And I would have no problem saying that a good part of that is selection into this category for doing it, because we're not looking at anything here in terms of controlling for things. And if we stratify that by age, by education, what we see is that these are the people who have less than a high school education, and still they're single working moms. They have higher rates. So you see education effects a lot during this thing, but you see these elevated risks even for women who are high school and above. And this is a kind of complicated slide, So this is a multivariate now. Now it's the hazards of dying. And in model 1, we're controlling for age and education and race and ethnicity. And you can see that, I'm sorry, the top, oh, I'm holding my finger over. This is the reference group. So single non-working mothers had a very high risk. Single working mothers had a high risk. And then you see this the working non-mother, married non-working mother, and then these people who married mothers who worked later. So married mothers who worked later are very similar to married mothers who worked earlier. So having all three, but with a little wiggle room, is the optimal place, is the sweet spot, it looks like. And then we control for smoking, alcohol, and body mass, and you see that accounts for some of these patterns, especially for single mothers. Up here, for working non-mothers, and here you see what's we just call, protections, masking. That married non-working mothers actually probably had worse health behaviors, so they increase a little bit. But overall, that's what you see there. And then if you start to account for wealth, you see actually that this risk goes from 2.1 to 1.7 here, and you still see the married non-working mother risk higher, but you see these various combinations. So overall, what you see is this sort of protection for single moms are at elevated risk whether they're working or not. If they're not working, they're at higher risk, and you see a protection overall for married women who are had kids who are working but took some time off. So then what we wanted to see is, well, imagine how stressful your job is or how little control you have over your job. Would that make a difference? Does it matter whether you have a lot of job control? So I always say, like, around this group, if we're doing all these things, we probably have high job control. Even though we have high job demands, we have high job control. We have a lot of schedule control. We can work our way through the day. So that was trying to see whether we could think about job strain in this model. And job strain turned out to be quite complicated to do. In fact, because the occupation categories that HRS uses were done in 1970 codes, and actually you want to look at 1980 job strains and 90s job strains and that kind of thing. So we actually worked very closely with Bob Krasik, who had done a lot of these job demand control questionnaires with both in Europe and the United States, so we could crosswalk them with occupations. So that's how we did this. We crosswalk with occupations. So these are not people's self-reported responses to job strain, to control or demand. They're actually linked to their occupational code. So we looked at the longest held job. We looked at occupation and industry measured with the 3-digit 1980 census codes. We crosswalked it with the 1970 codes. We used the Krasik average scores for 1970 occupations, and then we assigned continuous demand control scores, and then we trichotomized each one. So in the end, each person had a family trajectory, a control tertile, and a job demands tertile. So it's building on the old model going forward. And here again, in a model with a lot of things, you'll see the effects of single motherhood, like emerge even when we're controlling for a lot of things. And you'll see that job control, having low job control or medium job control, is associated with increased mortality risk net of these other things. So both single parenthood, basically, and job control emerge as important factors. And then we crosswalk further because we had this idea that job control would be particularly important for single mothers. That was kind of our idea here. And actually what you see is, so this is a later single mother, and if they had high job control, their relative risk was 1.2. If they were in low job control, it was 1.9. And you see also for single mothers with mid and low job control, also these elevated risks. And you see some of them emerging even for long-term married mothers. And actually you see this here too. So I would say this is not total confirmation that this was most important for single mothers, but it is important overall, and it certainly adds up for later single mothers with low job control have really quite high risk, and earlier single mothers as well. So it feels like we're on to something. I wouldn't say the story is wrapped up, but it feels like we're on to something. That some combination of working and having control and your marital status or your partnership status seems to be important in predicting long-run mortality. So the implications for the research are potentially stronger protections for working mothers might improve, and I'll show you some data on that. And the necessity of taking the whole life into account. I think more than what the policy implications are right now, the idea that you need to understand that people change a lot in their lives and a snapshot doesn't quite do it. So if you look at some people, these people look the same, even though they end up looking different in other ways, right? So if you have a snapshot here, they don't look like that. So understanding the implications for encapsulating this whole life course experience are really important. I feel like we took the first stab at doing that, clearly not the last stab at doing it. So now I want to show you one last thing, and then we can come back to these limitations. But I want to show you one that's a policy instrument where we were very interested in looking at the long-run effect of maternity leave benefits on women's mental health. There's been a lot of work looking at maternity leave benefits and the impact on children and on mothers at the time that they're delivering, the very close period, but very little idea, like what is the long-run impact of living in a place that has a maternity leave benefit for it. And we worked very closely with economists who had been looking at pensions and savings during this time, like what does it mean to keep women in the labor force, does it work, that kind of thing. So this is a study that we've done with people who are all in this social protection network, that project that we had, but Maurizio Avendano has led it, and we worked very closely with Agar Bujavita and Giacomo Passini, who are economists in Venice who work closely with the share data and have done a lot of work on these data. So the idea, again, is that labor force participation increased a lot. Women with children were no exception. These are the European data. So 1975, 38% of European women with at least one child were in the workforce. By 2011, it was 71%. And starting in the 1960s, there were lots of maternity benefits that were put into place. And that we also know, in this case, that depression is an outcome. When we're looking at share data, we don't actually have mortality data to look at. We have to look at something else. So we looked at depression, which was very common in old age, and we wanted to see whether this was linked with maternity benefits. So the data are from share, and we looked at people with complete working histories, complete fertility histories, mental health data in 2004 and 2006, and we controlled for a lot of different kinds of things, and this is 30,000 men and women over 13 European countries. And the policy data are from Anne Gautier's data, which are on family policy, looking at maternity, parental and child care leave policies, and cash benefits. And the database covers 1960 to 2010 for all share countries. And maternity leave was defined as leave granted only to mothers in connection with childbirth, usually includes a period of leave before and after childhood. And we only looked at maternity leave because we wanted to go back so far. Otherwise, we could look at paternity leave or family leave, but it doesn't allow you to go back to 1960 for enough countries. So this was a very, very homogeneous definition of maternity benefits that allowed us to look at a similar benefit and a cash benefit over this time. We looked at full wage weeks that you were actually compensated for as the instrument. And just to show you the variation, this is just paid maternity leave by country. So you can see that there's a lot of variation both across countries and over time. We actually took Sweden out of this because it's like it just makes the graph really high here. But even in Sweden, there's like a lot of variation for us to capitalize on. And we looked at first childbirths with the idea that full wage weeks if it's full wage weeks are low, future mothers might exit the labor force. We focus on women having their first child between 16 and 25 because we didn't want then the policy to actually change the behavior at some time. We look at country and year of birth fixed effects, and we control for a large number of variables. And basically, this is the difference in difference, looking at depression, and the interpretation is that there's a 16% difference in depression score between low versus high country-specific cutoffs for full wage weeks with respect to the mean value among European women. So women who had their first childbirth, who lived in a country at the time that they were having paid maternity benefits, had a reduction in depression of about 16%, which is pretty significant for this. And now we're looking at what might have accounted for that, and it's very hard to figure that out. But it looks like from the shared life histories, you can see, I mean, one possibility is actually that they didn't get depressed after they had their baby. So after childbirth, if you think not only about postpartum depression, which is like a very severe thing, but a more moderate kind of depression, it might have stopped that cycle, which is a lifelong cycle of depression that continues into old age. And it looks like that happened, although we can't tell a lot. But if you looked at the stress around the time of childbirth, it was less in countries that had better, more generous policies. It is also possible that it kept women in the labor force, and one of the things that they've said has been, the Venice group has said that it preserves pensions and wage for women, so it helps to keep people in the labor force, although I understand that that's rather controversial. There's data both ways on that. So we don't really know the pathways, and it might be multiple, but it looks like having in place a policy, potentially 30 or 40 years earlier that protects women during the time of childbirth could have these long-run kinds of consequences. So this is probably our strongest evidence in the sense that it's a policy instrument that we're looking at. We're looking at across a wide range of different things. The other data are observational. They have some selection issues, although we've controlled for everything that we could think of. And again, there is no one data set that solves this problem. Because anything that's great on the aging side often has a compromise when you look at midlife exposures. Anything that has great midlife, early adulthood data on marriage, family, education, and workforce is in existence long enough to have really great outcomes in old age. So I think there is no one way to tackle this. I think we all need to think about, well, I could shed light on this slice, I could shed light on this slice. But I do want to say that over time, I would say the accumulation of our evidence, and we've actually just finished a very, very large experiment in industries manipulating work, family, and schedule control kind of practices, is that I feel like the United States, especially for women at the bottom, is a tough place to be for a lot of reasons. But one of them is that we have this total kind of mounting risk of both having very few family resources, high odds of being a single mother, very kind of tenuous ties to work, and very few social protections at the same time. And this has the capacity to be a kind of perfect storm. And even if you think that the pathways are through health behaviors, through smoking or alcohol or other mental health outcomes, you have to think about, well, what is the fundamental social experience that's driving this kind of phenomena? And to me, there's something around this, and it isn't just the usual characters. So I think I will leave it there, and I think we have time for questions. Thanks.